My boss told me to train a man he said was here to support my workload, and at the time, I believed him. When I found out the truth that he was my replacement, boss didn't ask why I still kept a smiling face. My name is Marissa Cole, and I had spent 9 years building a reputation as the most reliable person in my department. When things broke, they called me. When clients were angry, they handed me the phone. When deadlines were impossible, I stayed late and made them possible. So when my boss leaned against my desk one Monday morning and said, "We're bringing in someone to help you. You've been stretched thin," I nodded. It made sense, or at least it sounded like it did. The new hire arrived before noon. Confident handshake, polished resume, introduced as a process coordinator. I welcomed him the way I always did, professionally, openly, without suspicion. I had no reason not to. I scheduled training sessions, walked him through systems, answered questions, explained workflows I had perfected over years. If anyone had asked me that day whether I thought I was training my replacement, I would have laughed. At that point, I still believed loyalty mattered. For the first 2 weeks, I trained him exactly the way my boss asked. I showed him what my role required, no more, no less. I followed every documented process, every official responsibility listed under my title. I didn't rush. I didn't withhold. I didn't question why someone supporting me needed access to systems I had waited years to earn. I assumed there was a reason. But small things began to feel off. He was added to meetings I wasn't invited to. He received emails marked leadership only. Once, he casually mentioned a future project I hadn't been told about, one that fell squarely under my responsibilities. I smiled through it, told myself I was overthinking. Then one afternoon, I overheard a conversation my boss didn't know I could hear. Just a few words, just enough. "Once she finishes training him, we'll transition." That was it. No drama, no explanation, just a plan I was never meant to know about. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't stop smiling. Because now that I finally understood what was happening, I also understood something else. They thought I was still clueless, and that mistake would cost them dearly. What bothered me wasn't that I was training him. It was how quickly my role began to shrink. He started attending meetings I had always led, not as an observer, but as a participant. Once, he spoke up during a client call and confidently answered a question I had spent years handling. No one corrected him. My boss didn't even look surprised. Later that day, I checked the project dashboard and noticed his name listed beside mine on initiatives that had always been solely my responsibility. No announcement, no explanation, just quiet edits. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Still, I began keeping track. Dates, access changes, invitations I no longer received. Nothing dramatic, just patterns forming where none had existed before. I smiled through all of it. Because if something was changing, I needed to understand exactly how and why before reacting. People mistake composure for ignorance. Because I didn't complain. Because I didn't confront anyone. Because I kept showing up, doing my job, and training him exactly as instructed. They assumed I hadn't noticed. They assumed I was grateful for help, that I was relieved to have the workload shared, that I was too focused on my tasks to see what was happening around me. Even my boss relaxed. He stopped checking in as often, stopped hovering, stopped pretending this was temporary. And that's when he made his second mistake. He underestimated how closely I was paying attention. Because while they were watching my smile, I was watching the system, and systems always tell the truth if you listen long enough. I didn't find out the way people expect. No whispered warning, no dramatic confession. I found out because my access was removed. One Tuesday morning, I logged in and was greeted by a polite error message telling me to contact administration. By noon, I learned my permissions were being restructured. Restructured. An hour later, I saw him log in effortlessly, using credentials that mirrored the ones I had lost. That was when it clicked. I wasn't training support. I wasn't mentoring a teammate. I was training my replacement. And the most unsettling part, my boss watched it happen without saying a word. I thanked it for their help. I returned to my desk. I finished the day exactly as I always had. Still smiling. People think the moment you discover betrayal is when you explode. It is. It's when you go quiet. I replayed every interaction from the last few weeks, the sudden urgency to document processes, the way my boss praised my selflessness, the encouragement to be thorough with my training. It wasn't incompetence. It was design. Confronting him would have given him control. Anger would have exposed fear, and fear would have accelerated the plan. So I did the opposite. I trained better than ever. Because if they thought I didn't know, they would keep revealing exactly how they planned to remove me. And that knowledge, that was leverage. Once I stopped asking questions, my boss relaxed. He began delegating directly to him instead of me, sometimes right in front of me, not rudely, casually, as if the shift had already been agreed upon. During meetings, my boss would say things like, "Why don't you handle that going forward?" and glance past me, not at me. I nodded, took notes, smiled. That smile convinced him I was harmless. He started sharing more than he should have, future restructuring plans, new leadership directions, vague comments about efficiency and cost cutting. Every word confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't replacing me because I was bad at my job. He was replacing me because I was expensive and powerful. The confirmation came by accident. Or maybe arrogance. He forwarded an email thread and forgot to remove an attachment, a planning document, internal only. My name was listed under phase out. His name sat comfortably under transition lead. Timeline, 30 days. No meeting, no warning, no conversation. I stared at the screen, heart steady, mind sharp. They thought I was being managed out quietly. What they didn't know was that every system they relied on, every process they were proud of, still had my fingerprints all over it. And fingerprints can prove ownership. From that moment on, my training changed. Not in a way anyone could accuse me of sabotage. Not in a way that broke policy. Not in any way that could be documented against me. I taught him exactly what was asked: procedures, workflows, tools. What I didn't teach him was judgment. I didn't explain why certain shortcuts worked. I didn't share the context behind decisions. I let him memorize steps without understanding consequences. On paper, he looked ready. In reality, he was fragile. And my boss mistook completion for competence. My boss started watching me more closely. I noticed it during meetings, the way his eyes lingered when I spoke, as if he was searching for something beneath my calm. He asked casually, "You're okay with all these changes, right?" I smiled and said, "Of course, I support the team." That answer unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Because people who are being pushed out usually fight. I didn't. And somewhere deep down, he realized something was off. But by then, it was already too late. It happened during a client review. A routine presentation, one I had handled dozens of times. He volunteered to lead it, confident, prepared. Halfway through, the client asked a question that wasn't on the slide deck. A simple one. He froze. He glanced at me just for a second. I met his eyes and smiled, but I didn't step in. He answered anyway. Wrong. The client didn't correct him. They just nodded slowly and said, "We'll circle back." That was the moment I saw doubt replace certainty. By the next morning, emails were flying. Clarifications requested, metrics questioned, decisions revisited. My boss was suddenly busy, ducking into offices, closing doors, making hurried calls. The confidence he'd worn so comfortably was slipping. A director pulled me aside later that afternoon. "You built that framework, didn't you? she asked quietly. I nodded. She looked back toward the conference room where my boss was packing. I thought so. For the first time since the plan began, someone else saw the truth. After the meeting, he avoided my eyes. By the end of the week, he couldn't. He started stopping by my desk with quick questions, then longer ones, then questions he should have known the answers to if the training had actually prepared him. I answered politely, precisely, just enough. Not to save him, but not to expose him either. Because watching someone struggle silently is far more revealing than correcting them publicly. My boss noticed. He started inserting himself into conversations, cutting them short, redirecting tasks. Too late. The damage was already visible. A performance report circulated the following Monday. My metrics hadn't changed, my delivery hadn't dipped. But his numbers, they were inconsistent. Suddenly, meetings included phrases like historical context and original architect. Suddenly, people were asking who had designed the systems before the transition. My boss called me into his office. "You're still committed here, right?" he asked. I smiled. Completely. He didn't smile back. When plans start failing, desperate people rush. My boss announced a sudden restructuring meeting, mandatory, last-minute, poorly explained. Roles were being realigned. Responsibilities optimized. Translation, he wanted this over with. He positioned the man I had trained as the new lead, effective immediately. No transition period, no overlap. He didn't look at me when he said it. I applauded with everyone else. Because rushing exposes weakness. At the end of the meeting, a senior executive asked a simple question. Who built the client escalation protocol he'll be managing? Silence. My boss opened his mouth, closed it. Every eye turned to me. I raised my hand calmly. I did, 5 years ago. The executive nodded slowly. Then we'll need you involved in oversight. My boss's jaw tightened. The room shifted. And for the first time, the future no longer belonged to him. What he didn't know was that, while I was training him exactly the way I'd been instructed, I had already adjusted my position in ways no title could reflect. At that point, I still believed he was brought in as additional support. That was the story I'd been told, and I chose to believe it, at least on the surface. So I did what I always did. I performed with excellence. I walked him through systems I had built from scratch, explained workflows no one else fully understood, and answered every question with patience and clarity. I smiled. I showed no resistance, no suspicion. What my boss failed to notice was that I wasn't just teaching tasks. I was restructuring processes. Every procedure I explained was rewritten into formal documentation. Every decision I made was logged. I began routing approvals through shared systems instead of verbal sign-offs. Slowly, quietly, ownership shifted from personalities to structures tied to me. I wasn't being defiant. I wasn't being emotional. I was being strategic. Because even before I fully understood what was happening, something in me knew this training wasn't as harmless as it looked. I didn't discover the truth through confrontation or confession. I discovered it through silence. An internal email landed in my inbox, one I wasn't meant to receive. Buried in corporate language was a phrase that made my stomach drop. Transition of responsibilities. My role, my projects, my systems, all listed neatly under his name with dates attached. In that moment, everything became clear. He wasn't there to learn. He was there to replace me. I remember staring at my screen, my face completely still. No panic, no anger, just clarity. Around me, the office hummed as usual, unaware that my entire professional reality had just shifted. I finished the day exactly as I had started it, calm, helpful, smiling. Not because I hadn't understood what was happening, but because now I knew the truth, and I also knew something my boss didn't. If he thought I was still reacting, he was already too late. That afternoon, My boss called me into his office and closed the door. His voice was calm, but his hands weren't. "You blindsided me in there," he said. "That wasn't appropriate." I tilted my head slightly. I answered a direct question. He exhaled sharply. "You need to understand how this looks." I did understand. It looked like the truth. He offered vague reassurances, future opportunities, possible roles, promises with no dates attached. I listened politely, thanked him, and left. Because when someone starts bargaining instead of commanding, their power is already gone. Oversight turned out to mean access. Suddenly, I was looped into performance reports, escalation logs, and client feedback again. Not quietly this time, formally. Patterns emerged quickly. Missed deadlines, confused priorities, decisions made without understanding downstream impact. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to show that something wasn't working. And none of it traced back to me. My boss stopped making eye contact in meetings. It happened subtly, almost politely. I received a calendar invite marked optional for a recurring meeting I had always chaired. The agenda was familiar, projects I had designed, metrics I had maintained, decisions I had overseen. Yet now my presence was treated as optional. I smiled. Everyone else assumed I hadn't noticed. They assumed this was the beginning of my decline. But I had noticed, and I was cataloging. Every shift, every oversight, every attempt to edge me out. Because the fewer people see the threads of a system, the easier it is to manipulate. And I wasn't about to let someone else weave the story of my work. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Leadership began to ask the questions that revealed the truth. Who designed this workflow? Who created the escalation protocol? Why are we seeing inconsistencies under the new LAID? Their curiosity wasn't for my boss. It was for answers, and all eyes kept landing on me. Calm, composed, smiling, I answered precisely, factually, and without emotion. Every question they asked was a confirmation. The man I had trained could mimic processes, but he didn't understand them. Leadership was starting to notice. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to demand recognition. I let the work speak. Reports, logs, metrics, and systems, everything I had built, served as proof. By the end of the week, my boss's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. He tried to redirect attention, to speak over me, to control the story, but the facts were unshakable. I smiled. Watching him scramble quietly was far more satisfying than confrontation. I had seen that smile for years, the one that suggested confidence, control, and untouchable authority. Now it was gone. Meetings were tense. He asked questions with a nervous edge, repeated himself unnecessarily, tried to regain control he no longer had. Every glance he cast my way was calculated. I returned it with a smile that said, calm, collected, untouchable. It wasn't arrogance. It was inevitability. Leadership called a special meeting. No one knew why in advance. The agenda, clear, roles, responsibilities, and accountability. The room shifted when it was my turn to speak. I outlined processes, clarified ownership, and presented metrics. Every project, every system, every client interaction I had built was under my name. My boss tried to intervene, but leadership had already seen the patterns. Questions directed at him faltered, answers sounded hollow. By the end of the meeting, the room had shifted. Respect, authority, and recognition had realigned. Within days, the formal change came through. My boss, the one who had orchestrated my removal, had his title reduced. Responsibilities were reassigned. Leadership made it clear. Influence comes from results, not perception. The man I had trained remained nominally in position, but his credibility had been quietly dismantled by the systems I had built. Leadership approached me quietly, privately, with an offer. A promotion to the role my boss had coveted. It wasn't just about the title. It was about authority, trust, and ownership of the very systems they had tried to reassign without me. I accepted, not triumphantly, not smugly, but with the same calm smile I had maintained the entire time. In the end, I didn't fight. I didn't scheme overtly. I simply let observation, expertise, and patience do the work. My promotion wasn't revenge, it was justice executed silently. The systems I had built remained intact, now under my control. The man I had trained, dependent, my boss, reduced and cautious, and I, still Marissa Cole, the professional who smiled while the world underestimated her. Because what they never understood was this: power isn't taken in anger or confrontation. Power is built quietly, meticulously, and maintained while everyone else assumes you're still smiling for nothing.